And thanks also to Harry and Nathaniel, and to all of the organisers and participants. It's really great to join this timely CEP discussion. I'm proud to have taken part in the series that Hans refers to of excellent CEP webinars on the Houthis, always with my good friends Ari and Hans, and of course Nathaniel also involved as well. The Houthis are obviously a topical concern, but few people have had the courage, as Ari and Nathaniel have here, to call them out properly for diverting and subverting the purpose of humanitarian assistance to the Yemeni people. The humanitarian community does not generally welcome scrutiny, and it expects the public, who we should remember are legitimate stakeholders because their taxes are being spent, but they expect them simply to take it on trust that they are doing good. The picture is more complicated than that, and we are in danger of disillusionment setting in. And that is already reflected in the phenomenon of donor fatigue, which Hans alluded to. Nathaniel and Ari are admirably measured in their analysis and their recommendations. Like me, they do not want to see humanitarian delivery fail. But my worry is that the failure of humanitarians to do due diligence, or to call out interference, or to welcome scrutiny may discredit the entire enterprise. The failure of member states like the UK to be more scientific, transparent, and honest in their evaluation of their aid delivery is equally troubling. I was the UK ambassador to Yemen, as Hans said, from 2015 to 2017. And I witnessed this failure at first hand. Like many humanitarians, the UK aid community was more concerned with ticking boxes and using up their budgets so that those budgets would not be cut in subsequent years. They emphasized delivery, but as this report says, it was not verified delivery to those in acute need. Audit depended upon local implementation partners, or IPs, and third-party monitors, TPMs, who were in some cases not directly known to any UK aid official. We should have done more to highlight the obvious risks flowing from this. Let me also say a few words about acute need, a bugbear of mine that is slightly off the subject of this report. I am not a fan of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. My experience at the UN was of an ethos of bullying and evading scrutiny or accountability. The approach was to insist that humanitarian delivery trumped all other concerns, and to suggest otherwise was to want people to starve. OCHA showed nothing but contempt for the Security Council's concerns about terror finance risks from aid delivery in places like Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen. As Ari and Nathaniel argue, the situation in Yemen is actually worse even than in Afghanistan and Somalia in terms of the due diligence processes. Now, famine is a terrible thing, but OCHA is like the boy who cried wolf. During my time working on Yemen, we were told that it was the world's most acute humanitarian crisis, and that any number up to half of the population, the entire population of the country, was about to starve to death. Needless to say, nothing of the kind ever happened. But the UN went on to make similarly extravagant claims about imminent famine in Afghanistan. Then the UN Secretary General published a bizarre social media post saying that, quote, 3 out of 4 of the hungriest people in the world are in Gaza, unquote. Now do the math on this, and you will see that it amounts to a claim that the number of people starving in the world, Yemen, plus Sudan, plus Afghanistan, plus, cannot amount to more than 1/3 of the population of Gaza. So, let's say 600,000-700,000 people are also amongst the hungriest people in the world, in the rest of the world outside Gaza. And yet they would happily talk about 20 million Yemenis being about to starve to death. Statistical illiteracy and cynical melodrama that causes donor fatigue. It also links to an argument that needs to be had, however painful, about whether tyrannies like the Houthis and the Taliban have learned to game the international community in such a way as to prop up their repellent regimes. Now, since October the 7th, 2023, something very odd has happened in the public reaction in Western countries to the complex crisis in the Middle East. Islamist extremists sympathetic to Hamas and the Houthis have been marching in London and other cities, side by side with misguided, self-proclaimed progressives, who of course would be arrested and beaten, or worse, if they lived in Gaza or northern Yemen. The two groups appear to be united only by hatred of Israel and the Jews, and a loathing or self-loathing of Western culture and values. Of all of the extremist and terrorist groups that take their lead from Iran, the Houthis are in fact one of the more independent-minded. They're capable of refusing to do Iran's bidding when it conflicts with their own interests, but they have become increasingly enthusiastic co-belligerents with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and the Iraqi Shia militias. The evidence now suggests that the Iranians are fully witting partners in this aggression. Iran is also directly involved in stoking up anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish incitement on the streets of Western cities. Having spent a good deal of time negotiating with the Houthis at a time when I was focused on achieving peace in Yemen, I want to complete this intervention by underlining from direct experience the vital warnings sounded in this paper. The Houthis are not a liberation movement. They are an extraordinarily virulent, chauvinistic, and violent group of oppressors and thieves. I will say that I strongly support a massive increase in the use of sanctions against these abusers of humanitarian aid, and in general, abusers of the Yemeni population. Sanctions have been underutilized and under-enforced in the case of Yemen. But I think I can actually most usefully contribute in the end of my presentation with a few anecdotes from my direct experience of the Houthis and some thoughts on the challenge that they pose today. I remember two moments of brutal clarity from senior Houthi leaders. One was when they told me, long before they actually did it, that they were only in an alliance of convenience with Ali Abdullah Saleh, but as soon as he ceased to be useful to them, they would kill him. The second was when they told me that they would inevitably win in Yemen in the end. They said, because you care and we don't. You care about the deaths of Yemenis, we don't care how many die. When enough have died, you will beg us to make peace. Now later, when I saw their snipers in Aden and Taz killing civilians for fun, doctors and nurses in a hospital ducking under window frames to go about their business because a gat-crazed Houthi sniper on a rooftop opposite was picking off anyone showing themselves at a window, my interlocutor's words came back to me. And I do want to underline that to you because, you know, humanitarian assistance is about saving lives. It's about reaching the people in greatest need. Never forget, this is a movement that talked about not caring how many people die, and in fact considering that the number of people who die would be ultimately what would force the Houthis' Western opponents, as they saw it, to make peace with them and to give them what they wanted. Now, later on in my time as ambassador, we had the Kuwait peace talks in the spring and summer of 2016. And I think those were the real peace talks where I think we probably came the closest that we have come to a positive outcome. It included the United Nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, many of the group of ambassadors supporting peace in Yemen, who were then known as the G18 group. And the Kuwaitis provided a guest palace for some of the talks, and they were good hosts. But the same cannot be said for the Houthi guests, who endlessly made unreasonable demands, insisted on a constant supply of gat, which I should say is an illegal drug in Kuwait, whose supply or possession is usually a serious criminal offence. The Houthis would arrive late at meetings, they would indulge in tantrums, walkouts, threats, recriminations, and they would change their negotiating position from day to day. There was a hilarious standoff when the chief Houthi negotiator, Mohammed Abdus-Salam, was shut out of his Facebook account because of the hateful material on it. Fixing that problem, i.e. getting him back on Facebook, despite the hateful material, required his ID. His ID indicated that he was 13 years old. Turned out that he'd travelled to Kuwait on his son's passport. Now, the Houthi delegation contained genuine seniors who continue to hold significant positions in the movement to this day. But I must record a reflection from a respected Yemeni politician and friend of mine, Abdul Karim al-Iriani, whose death during my time as ambassador was generally felt by people as an end of an era tragedy. He was an old man, he died of natural causes. But speaking of Mehdi Mashat, the most obnoxious and destructive member of the Houthi delegation, Iriani is said to have commented that his preferment to a senior role in those days was Iriani's own signal to sign off and die. Mashat had grown up in Sada as a feckless and meritless thug who just happened to be in Abdul Malik al-Houthi's circle. It seems that that is enough qualification to rise high in the de facto administration. He is now the so-called president. Nevertheless, we kept at it and edged closer and closer to an agreement. The chief Houthi negotiator and spokesman, Mohammed Abdus-Salam, who retains that role to this day, was serious about the Kuwait talks. It was a good deal for the Houthis, and he recognized that. He earned the confidence of the Saudis, and the outline of an agreement took shape whereby the Houthis would essentially hold most levers of power in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia would withdraw with dignity. Now, we can, of course, ask whether that was a good deal, but at the time, that was where the international community was headed, and it was what the Saudis wanted. Now, President Hadi, of course, would have been marginalized under this agreement, but his negotiators understood that they would not have Saudi backing in opposing the outcome. But just as we thought that we had a deal in Kuwait, the instructions changed from Sada. Abdul Malik al-Houthi was said to be angry with Abdus-Salam's supposed concessions. The Houthis walked away, and peace talks went on ice for years. The reason I mention all this in some detail is just to stress, I don't know how many people there are on this call who have spent a lot of time closeted in a room face-to-face with the Houthis, but it's important to know what kind of people they are. That's why I'm giving you these atmospherics. Now, interestingly, the UN announced in late December 2023 a, quote, significant step, unquote, towards a ceasefire in Yemen. So this is just 6 months ago. But the UN envoy celebrated this supposed progress without making reference to Houthi attacks on international shipping in the Red Sea. It may be that this Houthi tease of progress towards a ceasefire and peace talks was just a calculated move to play on the international community's long-standing desire for peace in Yemen. And also, of course, to make decisive action against the Houthis in Iran that much more difficult if it could be seen as undermining the prospects for peace. The Saudis still want to get out of this war that they have felt trapped in now for nearly a decade. And of course, the international community wants to see humanitarian needs in Yemen alleviated, which of course brings us back to the whole subject of this paper. I want to underline that deterrence of the Houthis and their aggression must be the priority. Until the Houthis stand down from their current illegal campaign to intimidate shipping in the Red Sea, there can be no progress towards peace. And humanitarian assistance should be diverted to ports controlled by the government of Yemen, since it clearly cannot be safe to ask ships to approach Hodeidah or any other Red Sea port. The report talks about the fact that there is a premium that's levied by the Houthis if aid shipments come through territory controlled by the government. But even so, I think there is a reasonable calculation to be made that that is something that should still be attempted, because that is actually the safest way of accessing Yemeni territory. And unlike the Houthis, who don't care if people starve in the government-controlled areas, people in the government-controlled areas do not want to see their compatriots starve in the Houthi-controlled areas. So this needs to be carefully thought about. This is the perfect opportunity for Western policymakers to review the findings and recommendations of Ari's and Nathaniel's excellent paper and insist on a new paradigm for humanitarian assistance for Yemen. Thank you very much, and I will of course be delighted to address any questions you have in the time remaining.